In the history of superheroes, certain characters emerge at precisely the moment a culture needs them. They do not simply reflect the world around them. They translate its deepest assumptions into human form. Superman arrived during an age defined by industrial expansion, technological optimism, and belief in progress. His powers transformed the great machines of his era into personal attributes. He could move faster than locomotives, lift what cranes could lift, travel farther than any vehicle humanity had yet created. He represented a civilization imagining its future through steel, engines, electricity, and production. The machine age looked at itself and dreamed of becoming a man. By the beginning of the 21st century, however, the structure of everyday life had changed. The technologies shaping society no longer occupied factory floors or assembly lines. They lived inside networks, databases, satellites, algorithms, and communication systems. Power increasingly flowed through information rather than industry. The most influential technologies became less visible even as they became more pervasive. Humanity was no longer simply building machines. It was learning to inhabit technological environments. The relationship between people and technology had begun to transform from external mastery into permanent integration. This transformation created a symbolic vacancy within the superhero landscape. If Superman represented the aspirations of industrial modernity, what figure could represent a civilization increasingly defined by digital connectivity, technological dependence, and the collapse of clear boundaries between human beings and the systems surrounding them? What kind of myth emerges when technology ceases to be a tool and becomes an ecosystem? What kind of hero speaks for a world where identity, labor, communication, and social belonging are all mediated by invisible networks operating beneath the surface of daily experience? For a brief period, DC Comics appeared to believe it had found the answer in Victor Stone. On paper, Cyborg seemed almost perfectly positioned to become the defining superhero of a new era. Unlike Superman, who embodied mastery over technology, Cyborg embodied coexistence with it. His story did not revolve around controlling machines from a position of superiority. It revolved around becoming inseparable from them. The distinction is subtle, but it reveals an enormous cultural shift. One hero represented humanity transcending its inventions. The other represented humanity merging with them. The symbolism became even more significant when viewed through the lens of representation. Superman emerged from a cultural landscape dominated by singular visions of national identity, heroism, and belonging. Cyborg arrived in a period increasingly concerned with diversity, inclusion, and the expansion of who could occupy the symbolic center of popular mythology. The possibility of a young black hero becoming one of the defining faces of the future carried enormous cultural weight. Victor Stone was not merely positioned as another member of a superhero team. He was being positioned as a symbol of where society imagined itself heading. What makes this particularly fascinating is that Cyborg's premise contains two powerful narratives operating simultaneously. The first is a story about technological evolution. The second is a story about social evolution. In theory, Victor Stone could have stood at the intersection of both. He could have become a vision of a future that was technologically advanced, while also being culturally broader than the worlds that produced earlier generations of heroes. He could have represented a civilization attempting to redefine itself on multiple fronts at once. Yet the closer one examines Cyborg's history, the stranger the story becomes. Because despite possessing all the ingredients necessary to become one of the most important superheroes of the modern era, Victor Stone has often remained trapped in a state of unresolved contradiction. The same characteristics that made him symbolically powerful also made him vulnerable to narratives that repeatedly reduced him to something less than what he could have been. Instead of becoming a clear symbol of the future, he became a battlefield upon which competing visions of the future struggled for dominance. This is where the central question of Cyborg's history begins to emerge. The question is not whether Victor Stone is a successful superhero, nor is it whether he deserves recognition as an important figure in comic book history. Those debates, while interesting, are ultimately secondary. The deeper question concerns what Cyborg reveals about the culture that created him, because the tensions surrounding Victor Stone are not accidents of storytelling. They reflect anxieties embedded within the society that imagined him. They expose uncertainties about technology, identity, representation, power, and belonging that remain unresolved even today. The contradiction sits at the center of the character, like a structural fracture hidden beneath a building's foundation. Cyborg is often celebrated as a symbol of progress, yet many of the stories surrounding him repeatedly transform his body into an object to be modified, upgraded, weaponized, managed, or controlled. He is frequently presented as a bridge between humanity and technology, yet that role often requires his humanity to recede behind his function. He is positioned as a milestone in representation, yet his narrative frequently echoes older cultural patterns that value utility more than personhood. The closer he moves toward the center of the stage, the more these tensions become impossible to ignore. What makes Cyborg compelling, then, is not merely the character himself. It is the collision of ideas taking place inside him. He stands at the intersection of competing forces that define the modern world. Individual identity confronts technological integration. Representation confronts institutional power. Inclusion confronts control. Human agency confronts systems that increasingly shape life from behind the scenes. Victor Stone becomes the territory upon which these conflicts play out, often without his consent, and sometimes without the awareness of the stories telling them. Perhaps that is why Cyborg remains such a fascinating figure decades after his creation. Not because he successfully resolved the questions he was built to embody, but because he never did. Superman emerged as a symbol of certainty. Cyborg emerged as a symbol of uncertainty. Superman reflected a civilization confident about where history was heading. Cyborg reflects a civilization no longer convinced that progress automatically leads to liberation. His story begins with the promise of a new future. What follows is the gradual discovery that the future itself may be far more complicated than anyone expected. To understand why Cyborg became such a complicated figure, it is necessary to begin long before his promotion to the Justice League, before debates about representation, and before he was ever positioned as a candidate to embody the digital age. Victor Stone's story begins with a much older narrative, one deeply embedded in the architecture of superhero fiction itself. It is the story of transformation through catastrophe. Something is taken away, something is broken, something is lost. Then a new identity emerges from the ruins. The genre has always been fascinated by this pattern because it mirrors a broader cultural fantasy. Trauma becomes destiny, damage becomes power, loss becomes purpose. Yet even within that familiar framework, Victor's origin possesses a distinct character. Many superheroes gain abilities through accidents that expand their possibilities. Victor gains his powers because his body is destroyed. The difference matters. Superman arrives already complete. Spider-Man is enhanced. The Flash is accelerated. Victor Stone survives. His transformation begins not as empowerment, but as emergency intervention. The technology that becomes Cyborg is not initially a gift. It is a response to catastrophe. Before he can decide what he wishes to become, decisions have already been made on his behalf. This distinction quietly shapes everything that follows. Cyborg is born from a crisis of agency. His story does not begin with mastery. It begins with dependence. The technology that saves him also fundamentally alters him. His new body allows him to live, but it simultaneously creates a permanent question that never entirely disappears. Where does Victor Stone end, and where does Cyborg begin? The question is not merely biological. It is symbolic. It concerns ownership, identity, and control. It concerns whether the self remains sovereign once it becomes inseparable from systems larger than itself. The uncertainty becomes even more significant when placed alongside Victor's life before the accident. Long before becoming Cyborg, Victor was often defined by expectations imposed upon him by others. He was gifted, talented, physically exceptional, and frequently positioned within narratives centered on achievement and performance. Parents, institutions, and authority figures saw potential within him. Yet potential can become its own form of pressure. The future often appeared less like an open landscape and more like a destination already chosen. Even before machinery entered the story, Victor was struggling with the tension between individual identity and external expectation. This is one of the reasons the character resonates so strongly as a symbol of modern life. His conflict is not simply technological. It is structural. The machinery attached to his body externalizes pressures that already existed. The accident does not create the conflict. It amplifies it. The technology merely makes visible forces that were already operating beneath the surface. Expectations become hardware. Social demands become circuitry. Obligation acquires physical form. The machine transforms abstract pressures into permanent architecture. At the same time, Cyborg emerged during a period when American comics were attempting to redefine the boundaries of heroism. The cultural landscape that produced many of the industry's foundational icons was changing. Audiences were becoming more diverse. Conversations about representation were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The symbolic center of popular mythology was beginning to shift. For decades, superheroes had largely reflected a narrow vision of who could occupy positions of power, visibility, and moral importance. New generations of readers expected something different. Victor Stone entered that environment carrying enormous symbolic potential. He was not merely another supporting character. He represented an opportunity to expand the image of the future itself. His presence suggested that technological progress and social progress might advance together. The idea was powerful. The hero representing humanity's technological future would not be another variation of familiar archetypes. He would be a young black man navigating questions of identity within a rapidly changing world. In theory, the symbolism was remarkably forward-looking. Yet symbols rarely operate in isolation. They inherit the assumptions of the cultures that create them. This is where Cyborg's history becomes increasingly complex. Because while Victor represented new possibilities, he also entered a storytelling tradition carrying older patterns and unresolved contradictions. Popular culture has often struggled with how it depicts black characters, particularly when those characters occupy highly visible symbolic roles. Representation creates opportunities for recognition, but visibility alone does not guarantee freedom from inherited narratives. One recurring pattern involves the relationship between personhood and utility. Throughout American history, black individuals have frequently been valued according to what they can produce, contribute, perform, or provide. Their labor, physicality, and function often receive greater attention than their inner lives. Popular culture did not invent these patterns. It inherited them, sometimes consciously, often unconsciously. As a result, even well-intentioned representations can reproduce older assumptions while believing themselves progressive. Viewed through this lens, certain aspects of Cyborg become difficult to ignore. His body is repeatedly framed as equipment. His upgrades become plot points. His capabilities become narrative focal points. His technological functions often receive greater emphasis than his emotional interiority. Stories become fascinated with what he can access, what he can connect to, what systems he can control, and what information he can process. The machinery becomes increasingly visible. the person sometimes becomes harder to see. What makes this dynamic especially fascinating is that it unfolds within a character explicitly designed to symbolize integration. Cyborg is supposed to bridge categories: human and machine, individual and network, present and future. Yet many stories inadvertently transform that bridge into a hierarchy. The technological aspects of his identity expand while the personal dimensions contract. The result is a character who often appears essential to the functioning of the narrative, while simultaneously struggling to occupy its emotional center. This tension becomes even clearer when compared to Superman. Superman's powers rarely threaten his status as a person. No matter how extraordinary his abilities become, stories continually return to Clark Kent's relationships, values, doubts, and choices. The powers serve the character. With Cyborg, the relationship frequently reverses. The character becomes responsible for serving the technology. His narrative role often revolves around facilitating the larger system. He becomes the gateway, the interface, the connection point through which the story operates. The irony is impossible to miss. The hero positioned to represent humanity's technological future often finds himself functioning less like a protagonist and more like infrastructure. He becomes indispensable but strangely peripheral, central to the machinery of the story, yet sometimes distant from its emotional gravity. The more technologically powerful he becomes, the more difficult it can be for the narrative to define him outside that power. His expansion creates a kind of contraction. New capabilities emerge while older dimensions of identity recede into the background. By the time DC began positioning Cyborg as a founding member of the Justice League, these tensions had already been accumulating beneath the surface. The decision made sense on multiple levels. The digital age needed a representative. The Justice League needed to evolve. The future required new symbols. Victor appeared capable of fulfilling all these functions simultaneously. He could stand alongside Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman as evidence that the mythology itself was evolving. But this promotion also intensified every contradiction embedded within the character. The larger the stage became, the greater the symbolic pressure. Cyborg was no longer merely a superhero navigating personal struggles. He was increasingly being asked to represent ideas about technology, race, modernity, progress, and the future itself. The expectations surrounding him expanded dramatically. And with that expansion came a question that would quietly shape the next phase of his history. Could a character built around integration remain fully human once he became responsible for symbolizing an entire technological era? Or would the very qualities that made him valuable gradually transform him into something closer to a function than a person? The answer would not emerge all at once. It would reveal itself through a series of creative decisions, cultural assumptions, and narrative priorities that slowly reorganized the meaning of Cyborg's existence. What began as a story about a young man adapting to transformation would increasingly become a story about what happens when an individual is absorbed into systems larger than himself. And once that process began, the conflict at the center of the character could no longer remain hidden beneath the machinery. The decision to elevate Cyborg into the Justice League was not merely a publishing choice. It was a declaration about the future. For decades, the League had functioned as DC's symbolic center, a kind of cultural throne room occupied by figures who represented the highest aspirations of their respective eras. Superman embodied industrial optimism. Batman embodied institutional power shaped through human will. Wonder Woman embodied ideals that transcended ordinary political boundaries. To place Victor Stone among them was to suggest that he belonged to the same symbolic lineage. At first, the logic seemed compelling. In many ways, Cyborg appeared uniquely qualified for the role. The 21st century was becoming increasingly dependent on digital infrastructure. Communication networks, data systems, satellites, and algorithms were reshaping daily life with extraordinary speed. Unlike earlier heroes, Victor did not merely use technology. He existed within it. His body functioned as a living intersection between human consciousness and technological systems. If mythology serves as a mirror reflecting the deepest structures of an era, then Cyborg looked remarkably suited to become one of its defining myths. Yet this promotion immediately revealed an underlying problem. Superman's symbolic power emerges from simplicity. His core identity remains remarkably stable regardless of how large his stories become. The same is true of Batman and Wonder Woman. Their narratives expand outward from strong internal foundations. Cyborg's foundation was different. His identity was already organized around a question rather than an answer. He was not a symbol of certainty. He was a symbol of negotiation. Every aspect of his existence revolved around boundaries that remained unresolved. That uncertainty became increasingly difficult to manage once he entered the symbolic center of the DC universe. The Justice League traditionally functions as a stage upon which heroes embody clear principles. They represent ideals large enough to organize entire narratives around themselves. But Cyborg's central conflict resists stability. His defining characteristic is not mastery, but integration. He exists between categories, between worlds, between states of being. The closer he moved toward the center of the mythology, the more obvious it became that he was carrying a fundamentally different kind of symbolic weight. This shift transformed how stories approached him. Rather than focusing primarily on Victor Stone as an individual, many narratives became fascinated by Cyborg as a technological phenomenon. His body increasingly functioned as a narrative gateway through which larger systems could enter the story. Alien networks, planetary defense grids, digital consciousnesses, surveillance systems, hidden databases, interdimensional technologies. The scale expanded constantly. The machinery became more powerful. The connections became more vast. And yet something curious happened during this process. Victor himself often seemed to recede. This was not necessarily the result of malicious intent. In fact, it emerged naturally from the logic of the character's abilities. The more interconnected Cyborg became, the more tempting it was for writers to use him as a solution to increasingly complex narrative problems. Need access to hidden information. Cyborg can find it. Need communication across impossible distances. Cyborg can facilitate it. Need connection to a technological system beyond human comprehension. Cyborg can interface with it. His utility expanded almost without limit. But utility carries consequences. Within stories, characters often receive attention proportional to the problems they solve. Yet emotional significance follows a different logic. Audiences connect most deeply with individuals whose internal struggles remain visible. The more Cyborg became essential to the functioning of the narrative, the greater the risk that he would become identified primarily through function. He was everywhere. He could do everything. Yet his role increasingly resembled infrastructure rather than agency. The distinction may seem subtle, but it fundamentally altered the symbolic meaning of the character. Infrastructure is indispensable. Entire civilizations collapse without it. Yet infrastructure rarely occupies the emotional center of collective imagination. People notice bridges when they fail. They notice electrical grids when power disappears. Infrastructure supports experience rather than embodying it. As Cyborg's technological capabilities expanded, many stories unintentionally positioned him within this framework. He became essential but strangely invisible. The irony becomes even sharper when examined through the lens of representation. Victor Stone was being elevated as evidence that superhero mythology was evolving. He occupied one of the most visible positions in American popular culture. Yet visibility itself proved insufficient. The question was never simply whether he appeared at the center of the stage. The deeper question concerned what role he was allowed to perform once he arrived there. Again and again, the answer drifted towards service. Cyborg connected systems. Cyborg solved technical problems. Cyborg enabled larger institutions to function. Cyborg became the mechanism through which organizations operated more efficiently. His body often existed as a strategic asset within structures larger than himself. The pattern is subtle enough that it rarely attracts immediate attention, yet once noticed it becomes difficult to ignore. The hero representing technological integration repeatedly finds himself integrated into systems that depend upon him while simultaneously defining him. This dynamic transformed the original promise surrounding the character. Initially, Cyborg seemed positioned to embody a future in which technology expanded human possibility. Increasingly, however, stories began exploring a different possibility. What if technological integration creates new forms of dependence? What if connection gradually becomes absorption? What if becoming indispensable to a system means surrendering the ability to exist outside it? These questions push Cyborg into territory far more psychologically interesting than many superhero narratives typically occupy. Superman's greatest conflicts often involve how power should be used. Cyborg's conflicts increasingly revolve around ownership. Who controls the technology? Who determines its purpose? Who benefits from its existence? Most importantly, who retains authority over the person living inside it? As these tensions accumulated, Victor's body became a contested territory. Different institutions, organizations, technologies, and ideologies projected competing futures onto him. Governments viewed him as an asset. Scientists viewed him as innovation. Strategic organizations viewed him as infrastructure. Technological systems viewed him as a point of access. Everyone seemed to possess an opinion regarding what Cyborg could become. Victor himself often appeared trapped within the center of these competing expectations. This is where the deeper symbolic fracture begins to emerge. The original fantasy surrounding Cyborg imagined harmony between humanity and technology. It envisioned a future in which integration could occur without sacrificing personhood. Yet the stories increasingly revealed how difficult that balance actually is. Every new upgrade introduced additional complexity. Every expanded capability created new dependencies. Every connection widened the distance between Victor's individual desires and the functions others expected him to perform. The result was a gradual reorganization of the character's symbolic identity. Cyborg no longer appeared solely as a vision of technological evolution. He became a site of negotiation between competing ideas about what technological evolution means. One vision imagined empowerment. Another imagined management. One imagined freedom through connectivity. Another imagined incorporation into systems too large to resist. One imagined expansion of selfhood. Another imagined its gradual dilution. What makes this transformation so fascinating is that both interpretations remained present simultaneously. Cyborg never fully became a symbol of liberation, nor did he fully become a symbol of control. Instead, he occupied the unstable territory between them. His stories increasingly reflected a culture uncertain whether technology represented humanity's next great expansion or its next great surrender. And once that uncertainty entered the character, it began reshaping everything around him. The question was no longer whether Cyborg could represent the future. The question had become which future he was actually representing. As Cyborg's role expanded throughout the DC universe, the contradiction at the center of the character became increasingly difficult to conceal. What had initially appeared to be a story about adaptation slowly revealed itself as a story about ownership. The technology integrated into Victor Stone's body was never entirely neutral. It carried intentions, expectations, and demands of its own. More importantly, It attracted institutions that viewed his existence not as a personal experience, but as a strategic opportunity. The closer Cyborg moved toward the center of power, the more his body became a territory claimed by competing forces. This shift mirrors a broader transformation that occurred within modern society itself. Industrial technologies were largely external. A factory could dominate a city without entering the individual. Digital technologies operate differently. They function through integration. Their power emerges not from standing outside the user, but from becoming embedded within everyday life. The smartphone is not merely a tool. The network is not merely infrastructure. They become extensions of memory, communication, attention, and identity. Cyborg's narrative increasingly reflects this transition. His machinery is not something he possesses. It is something he inhabits, even as it inhabits him. What makes Victor's situation particularly compelling is that his struggle rarely takes the form of open rebellion. Many superhero stories organize themselves around visible confrontations. A villain appears. A battle occurs. A resolution follows. Cyborg's most significant conflict often unfolds beneath that level of visibility. It exists within the relationship between selfhood and function. The threat is not always physical destruction. Sometimes it is gradual redefinition. The danger lies in becoming so useful that one's value becomes inseparable from utility itself. Again and again, stories return to this pattern. Cyborg gains access to greater technological capabilities. His connection to larger systems expands. New possibilities emerge. Yet every expansion introduces a corresponding reduction. The narrative becomes increasingly interested in what he can access rather than what he desires. His capabilities become easier to describe than his aspirations. His functions become more visible than his interior life. The machinery acquires narrative gravity. Victor Stone struggles to maintain the same weight. This is where the symbolic implications become impossible to ignore. Throughout much of American history, Black identity has often been framed through a language of performance, productivity, and usefulness. The individual becomes visible through what they provide rather than who they are. Different eras express this dynamic through different institutions, but the underlying pattern remained remarkably persistent. Recognition frequently arrived attached to function. Acceptance frequently required utility. Inclusion often depended upon service to structures that remained fundamentally unchanged. Cyborg was never designed as a deliberate expression of these historical realities. Yet cultural narratives do not require conscious intention to reproduce deeper patterns. They absorb assumptions from the environments that produce them. As a result, Victor Stone increasingly occupies a position that feels uncomfortably familiar. He is celebrated, respected, and included. He is undeniably important. Yet his importance often emerges through the services he provides to larger systems. His body becomes a resource. His technological integration becomes infrastructure. His value is repeatedly articulated through functionality. This creates one of the most fascinating tensions in modern superhero mythology. On the surface, Cyborg appears to represent progress. He occupies positions that would have been inaccessible to many earlier Black characters in mainstream comics. He stands among legendary heroes. He participates in world-shaping events. He receives visibility that previous generations could scarcely imagine. Yet beneath that visibility exists a recurring narrative structure in which personhood competes against utility for narrative dominance. The representation advances. The underlying logic often remains surprisingly familiar. The more one examines Cyborg through this lens, the more his origin story begins to feel significant in ways that extend far beyond its immediate plot. Victor does not choose transformation. Transformation happens to him. The technology enters his life through catastrophe. Others determine what must be done. Others decide what is necessary. Others rebuild his body according to their understanding of survival. The process saves his life, but it also establishes a pattern that echoes throughout his history. Agency arrives after intervention. Self-determination follows reconstruction. The individual inherits a future designed by external forces. Many of the characters' most memorable stories revolve around this tension. Victor repeatedly seeks ownership over his own existence. He attempts to define himself beyond the machinery. He searches for an identity that cannot be reduced to hardware, software, connectivity, or strategic value. Yet the world around him consistently pulls in the opposite direction. Governments want access. Organizations want cooperation. Technologies seek integration. The systems surrounding him recognize his usefulness long before they recognize his humanity. What emerges from this conflict is a profound ambiguity regarding the meaning of technological evolution itself. Early visions of the digital future often promised empowerment. Information would become accessible. Communication would become universal. Barriers would disappear. Humanity would become more connected, more informed, and more capable. Cyborg initially appears to embody that optimism. He is stronger because of technology, more knowledgeable because of technology, more connected because of technology. Yet as his stories develop, another possibility begins to emerge. Connection can become dependency. Access can become surveillance. Integration can become assimilation. The same systems that empower individuals can also absorb them. The same networks that expand possibility can reorganize identity around their own requirements. Cyborg stands precisely at the point where these competing futures collide. He is neither entirely liberated nor entirely controlled. He exists within the pressure created by both possibilities simultaneously. This is why Cyborg often feels fundamentally different from earlier superhero icons. Superman reassures. Batman strategizes. Wonder Woman inspires. Their symbolic functions remain relatively stable even when their stories become darker or more complex. Cyborg, by contrast, introduces uncertainty directly into the structure of the myth itself. His existence raises questions without providing clear answers. Every advancement contains a hidden cost. Every solution generates new complications. Every expansion of capability produces new forms of vulnerability. The result is a character who increasingly resembles the world that produced him. Modern life is defined by systems that promise convenience while collecting information. Networks that connect while monitoring. Technologies that empower while creating dependence. The same tools that expand freedom often generate new forms of constraint. Cyborg becomes a living expression of this paradox. His body transforms into a contested frontier where competing visions of progress struggle for dominance. By this stage of his evolution, the original comparison to Superman begins to reveal its deeper significance. Superman emerged from a culture largely convinced that progress was inherently desirable. Cyborg emerges from a culture increasingly uncertain about what progress actually means. The machine age imagined technology as a ladder. The digital age increasingly experiences technology as an environment. One invites ascent. The other demands adaptation. One promises mastery. The other requires coexistence. And it is precisely this shift that transforms Cyborg from a straightforward superhero into something far more unsettling. He is not merely a hero navigating technological change. He is a reflection of a civilization attempting to understand whether its own creations remain under human control. The more central he becomes to the mythology, the more he begins to embody questions that extend far beyond comic books. Questions about autonomy, questions about identity, questions about whether inclusion within powerful systems necessarily produces empowerment, or whether it sometimes conceals new forms of dependence. By the time these tensions fully crystallize, Cyborg is no longer functioning simply as a character. He has become a symbolic battleground. not between heroes and villains, but between competing interpretations of the future itself. And that conflict would push the character toward his most revealing stage yet, the moment when the contradictions embedded within his story ceased to be background tensions and became the defining feature of his entire legacy. Eventually, the contradictions surrounding Cyborg become too significant to remain hidden beneath questions of technology, power levels, or narrative utility. What emerges instead is a deeper conflict concerning the difference between visibility and transformation. This is the stage where Cyborg's story stops being primarily about Victor Stone and begins revealing something about the cultural systems that elevated him in the first place. The question is no longer whether he occupies a prominent position within the mythology. The question becomes what that prominence actually accomplishes. For many readers, Cyborg's rise represented evidence of genuine progress. There was good reason for that perception. A black hero occupying a central position within the Justice League would have been nearly unimaginable during earlier periods of comic book history. His presence signaled that the symbolic center of superhero culture was expanding. New voices, new identities, and new experiences were being permitted onto a stage that had historically been far more restrictive. From this perspective, Cyborg's existence appears undeniably meaningful. He is proof that the boundaries of representation can move. Yet representation creates a peculiar kind of tension. It changes who is visible within a system, but it does not automatically change the assumptions organizing that system. A throne can receive a new occupant while remaining fundamentally the same throne. A city can expand its borders while preserving the hierarchy at its center. Inclusion and transformation are related concepts, but they are not identical. One concerns access. The other concerns structure. This distinction lies at the heart of Cyborg's most revealing contradiction. Throughout much of his history, he functions as evidence that superhero mythology has become more inclusive. At the same time, many of the narratives surrounding him continue to organize themselves around patterns that feel remarkably familiar. Victor gains access to visibility, yet frequently struggles to gain narrative autonomy. He occupies the center of the stage, yet often remains defined by the needs of the larger system. His presence changes the image of power, while leaving certain assumptions about power itself largely intact. What makes this particularly fascinating is that the tension rarely presents itself openly. There is no singular story in which Cyborg is explicitly denied significance. On the contrary, he is consistently described as important. He is powerful. He is necessary. He is respected. The difficulty emerges from the specific form that importance takes. Again and again, his value is articulated through contribution, through functionality, through what he provides to the larger structure. The pattern repeats with such consistency that it begins to feel less like a creative decision and more like a gravitational force operating beneath the narrative. Gravity is an appropriate metaphor because the character seems caught between two centers of symbolic mass. One center pulls him toward individuality, toward personhood, toward the specific emotional, psychological, and cultural realities that make Victor Stone unique. The other pulls him toward abstraction, toward systems, toward networks, toward the role of technological intermediary. Neither force completely overpowers the other. Instead, Cyborg exists within the pressure generated by their constant competition. This pressure becomes increasingly visible when comparing Cyborg to the heroic figures who traditionally occupy mythology's highest positions. Superman represents an idealized individual. Batman represents an idealized will. Wonder Woman represents an idealized moral vision. Even when these characters become symbolic, they remain rooted in recognizable personal identities. Their stories continually return to the people beneath the myth. Their symbolic significance expands outward from a stable center. Cyborg often experiences the opposite movement. The symbolic dimensions of his character expand so rapidly that they threaten to overwhelm the individual at the center. He becomes an interface, a network, a technological frontier, a strategic asset, a bridge between worlds. Each new layer adds significance while simultaneously creating distance. The mythology grows larger. Victor sometimes becomes harder to locate within it. The unsettling implication is that Cyborg's struggle mirrors a broader condition of modern existence. Contemporary life increasingly encourages individuals to understand themselves through systems, through metrics, through networks, through productivity, through visibility, through participation in structures operating at scales no individual can fully comprehend. People become profiles, users, data points, audiences, consumers, and contributors. They remain individuals, yet are constantly translated into functional categories that larger systems can process. Cyborg occupies this reality in literal form. His body transforms the abstract pressures of modern life into visible architecture. The machinery attached to him serves as a symbolic amplification of forces that increasingly shape everyone. The fear that technology may reduce people to functions. The fear that visibility may not guarantee recognition. The fear that inclusion may coexist with forms of control subtle enough to appear benign. These anxieties exist throughout contemporary culture. Cyborg simply gives them a face. This is why the character often feels suspended between two competing narratives about the future. The first imagines technology as a vehicle for human expansion. In this version, Cyborg becomes a pioneer, a figure standing at the frontier of a new stage of human development. His integration with technology represents adaptation rather than loss. The future appears as a landscape of possibility, and Victor becomes one of its first successful inhabitants. The second narrative imagines something very different. Here, technology functions less like a frontier and more like an empire. It expands relentlessly, incorporating individuals into increasingly complex systems of management, observation, and dependency. In this interpretation, Cyborg's story becomes more ambiguous. His power remains real, but it arrives attached to obligations, expectations, and forms of integration he never fully chose. The future still advances, yet its direction becomes harder to trust. Neither narrative completely defeats the other. That is precisely what makes Cyborg so revealing as a cultural figure. He exists at the intersection where optimism and anxiety become inseparable. He embodies both the promise and the uncertainty of technological modernity. Every attempt to read him as a symbol of liberation encounters evidence of constraint. Every attempt to read him as a symbol of control encounters evidence of agency. The contradiction remains unresolved because the culture that produced him remains unresolved. At this point, the comparison to Superman acquires an entirely different meaning. Early discussions often focused on whether Cyborg could become the next great icon, the next defining superhero, the next representative of a changing world. But the deeper truth may be that he was never designed to fulfill the same symbolic function. Superman emerged from a civilization organized around confidence. Cyborg emerges from a civilization organized around complexity. Superman reassures people that humanity can transcend its limitations. Cyborg asks what happens when humanity can no longer distinguish itself from the systems it creates. That question changes everything. It transforms Cyborg from an unfinished Superman into something far more specific to his historical moment. He becomes a reflection of a society attempting to negotiate competing visions of identity, technology, power, and progress all at once. The reason his promise often feels unrealized is not necessarily because the character failed. It may be because he was carrying contradictions too large for any single superhero to resolve. And that realization pushes the discussion beyond questions of storytelling quality or editorial decisions. The issue is no longer whether Cyborg was used effectively. The issue is what his persistent ambiguity reveals about the culture that continues to reinvent him. Because the character's most enduring function may not be representing the future at all. It may be exposing how uncertain modern society remains about the future it is actively building. The most revealing aspect of Cyborg's history is that the character eventually transcends the boundaries of his own narrative. At a certain point, the discussion ceases to be about Victor Stone as an individual and becomes a conversation about the cultural environment that continually produces him. This is often the fate of major mythological figures. They stop functioning as isolated characters and begin operating as symbolic territories where broader social anxieties, aspirations, and contradictions can be negotiated. Cyborg occupies precisely this kind of territory. His significance extends beyond the stories he appears in because the tensions embedded within his character mirror tensions embedded within contemporary society itself. This is one reason why discussions surrounding Cyborg often feel larger than the character's publication history would suggest. On paper, many heroes possess more iconic stories, greater popularity, or stronger commercial success. Yet Cyborg repeatedly returns to cultural conversations because he sits at the intersection of several unresolved questions that continue to shape public life. Questions about technology, questions about identity, questions about inclusion, questions about power, questions about the relationship between individuals and systems that increasingly organize modern existence. His symbolic value emerges not from certainty, but from the fact that he remains a site of ongoing negotiation. Technology occupies a particularly important place within this negotiation because Cyborg arrived during a period when public attitudes toward technological progress were beginning to shift. Earlier generations often imagined technology through the language of expansion. New inventions created new opportunities. New systems increased efficiency. New capabilities promised greater freedom. Progress appeared directional. The future seemed to move toward larger horizons. This optimism shaped much of 20th century popular culture and informed countless visions of what technological advancement would eventually achieve. By the time Cyborg was elevated into one of DC's central figures, that confidence had begun to erode. Technology remained impressive, but it also appeared increasingly difficult to separate from questions of surveillance, dependency, corporate power, information control, and social fragmentation. The same networks that connected people also monitored them. The same systems that expanded access also concentrated influence. The same platforms that promised participation often transformed users into resources. The future no longer appeared as a simple story of liberation. It looked increasingly like a negotiation between competing forms of empowerment and control. Cyborg's symbolic position within this environment is remarkable because he embodies both interpretations simultaneously. He can be read as the ultimate success story of technological integration. His abilities surpass ordinary human limitations. He accesses information instantly. He communicates across impossible distances. He survives injuries that would otherwise be fatal. From one perspective, he represents humanity's next evolutionary step. The boundaries that once constrained individuals have been overcome through technological advancement. Yet the same facts support a completely different reading. His body exists within networks he cannot fully escape. His identity remains entangled with systems that often exceed his control. His technological enhancements create dependencies that continuously reshape his relationship with the world around him. The machinery that empowers him also places him within structures larger than himself. Rather than transcending systems, he becomes integrated into them. The distinction is subtle, but culturally significant. One narrative imagines technology serving humanity. The other imagines humanity adapting itself to technological environments. This ambiguity helps explain why Cyborg often feels more contemporary than many traditional superhero archetypes. The modern individual increasingly occupies a similar position. Daily life unfolds through technological infrastructures that are both empowering and constraining. Communication depends upon platforms. Memory depends upon devices. Economic participation depends upon networks. Social visibility depends upon systems of amplification governed by forces that remain largely invisible to those using them. Cyborg's body externalizes these realities. His visible machinery transforms abstract cultural conditions into something that can be observed directly. The question of representation introduces another layer of complexity. Cyborg is frequently celebrated as a milestone within the history of mainstream superhero comics, and rightly so. His presence challenged long-standing assumptions regarding who could occupy positions of symbolic importance within popular mythology. He expanded the range of identities visible at the center of one of America's most influential narrative traditions. For many readers, that visibility carried genuine emotional and cultural significance. Recognition matters. Presence matters. Access to symbolic space matters. At the same time, Cyborg's history reveals the limitations of treating visibility as a complete solution. Representation changes the image presented by a system, but it does not automatically transform the deeper structures organizing that system. This distinction often produces discomfort because visibility is easier to measure than transformation. A character can be promoted, a role can be expanded, a face can be placed at the center of the stage. Yet the underlying assumptions governing how that character functions may remain remarkably stable. This tension appears repeatedly throughout Cyborg's history. He gains access to positions traditionally reserved for iconic heroes. He becomes more visible than many earlier Black characters could have imagined. Yet the narratives surrounding him often continue to define his significance through service, utility, and integration into larger structures. The symbolic center expands, but the logic organizing that center does not always evolve at the same pace. As a result, Cyborg becomes a fascinating case study in the difference between inclusion and empowerment. This distinction resonates far beyond comic books because it reflects broader social debates. Modern institutions frequently celebrate diversity while leaving deeper distributions of power untouched. New voices enter established systems, yet the expectations governing participation often remain unchanged. Representation becomes real and meaningful, but it exists alongside structural continuities that are more difficult to address. Cyborg's narrative repeatedly encounters this dilemma. His presence signals progress. His function often reveals the limits of that progress. The result is a character who becomes unusually effective at exposing contradictions that many cultural narratives prefer to smooth over. Most superhero myths rely upon clarity. Heroes represent ideals. Villains represent threats. The symbolic architecture remains relatively stable. Cyborg disrupts that simplicity. He introduces competing interpretations that refuse easy reconciliation. Is technological integration liberating or restrictive? Is inclusion transformative or symbolic? Does visibility challenge power or become absorbed by it? These questions persist because the culture asking them has not reached consensus. There is also something striking about how Cyborg reshapes the relationship between mythology and infrastructure. Traditional heroes often stand above the systems surrounding them. They influence society from positions of relative independence. Cyborg rarely enjoys that distance. He functions within the networks he navigates. He is connected to the systems he influences. He becomes part of the architecture itself. Symbolically, this reflects a major shift in how contemporary culture imagines power. The heroic figure no longer stands outside the machine. The heroic figure exists inside it. This shift helps explain why Cyborg sometimes appears less emotionally satisfying than older archetypes while simultaneously feeling more relevant. Classical heroes often reassure audiences by establishing clear boundaries between the individual and the world. Cyborg erodes those boundaries. His story suggests that modern life may not permit such clean separations. Individuals remain individuals, but they are increasingly embedded within technological, economic, and cultural systems that shape behavior long before conscious choices occur. The character does not resolve this condition. He reflects it. Perhaps this is why discussions about Cyborg often generate such divergent interpretations. Different readers project different futures onto him. Some see a symbol of adaptation and resilience. Others see a warning about technological dependency. Some celebrate his visibility as evidence of cultural progress. Others focus on the structural limitations embedded within his portrayal. Both readings remain persuasive because the character contains evidence supporting each of them. Cyborg functions less like a completed statement and more like an unresolved argument. That unresolved quality may ultimately be his greatest cultural significance. Popular mythology often reveals the deepest anxieties of an era not through the questions it answers, but through the questions it cannot stop asking. Cyborg repeatedly returns to the same fundamental uncertainty. What happens when human beings become inseparable from the systems they create? The character approaches that question from technological, social, racial, and cultural directions simultaneously. Every path leads back to the same contested territory, and that is what makes Victor Stone so fascinating as a modern myth. He does not stand at the center of a stable future. He stands at the center of a disputed one. His body becomes a map of competing possibilities. His history becomes a record of unresolved negotiations. His symbolism becomes an echo of a society attempting to understand whether integration represents the next stage of human freedom or the beginning of something far more complicated. By the end of this story, the most interesting question is no longer whether Cyborg succeeded or failed as a character. Success and failure are ultimately too small as categories. They imply a clear destination, a final measurement, a definitive verdict. Cyborg's history resists that kind of conclusion. What remains instead is something far more revealing. Victor Stone became a mirror reflecting tensions that the culture surrounding him has yet to resolve. The reason discussions about the character continue decades after his creation is not because he provided answers. It is because the questions embedded within him have only become more relevant. This is why the comparison to Superman remains so illuminating. Not because Cyborg was supposed to replace Superman, but because the distance between them reveals a profound transformation in how different eras imagine the future. Superman emerged from a civilization largely convinced that history possessed direction. Progress was assumed to be real. Technology was assumed to be beneficial. Expansion was assumed to be desirable. The future appeared as an open horizon waiting to be reached. Superman stood at the center of that vision, like a banner planted in unexplored territory. Cyborg emerges from a fundamentally different psychological landscape. His world does not lack technological advancement. If anything, it possesses too much of it. The uncertainty comes from interpretation. Society no longer debates whether technology can transform human life. It debates what those transformations mean. The future is no longer imagined as a destination. It increasingly resembles a negotiation. Every advancement introduces new possibilities alongside new vulnerabilities. Every innovation creates opportunities while generating unforeseen consequences. Cyborg embodies that ambiguity with remarkable precision. What makes this especially fascinating is that the character's unresolved nature may ultimately be more valuable than the certainty offered by earlier myths. Traditional heroic icons often function as cultural anchors. They stabilize meaning. They reinforce shared assumptions. They reassure audiences that certain values remain intact despite changing circumstances. Cyborg performs a different function. He destabilizes. He complicates. He forces attention toward contradictions that cannot easily be dismissed. Rather than standing upon a secure foundation, he reveals fractures running through the foundation itself. Those fractures become particularly visible when examining the relationship between representation and power. Cyborg remains an important milestone in the history of mainstream superhero fiction. That reality should not be minimized. His visibility mattered. His presence mattered. His elevation to the symbolic center of one of America's most influential mythologies mattered. Entire generations of readers encountered possibilities through Victor Stone that previous generations rarely received. The cultural significance of that achievement is real. Yet Cyborg's legacy also demonstrates that representation is not the endpoint of a cultural conversation. It is the beginning. Visibility creates opportunities for deeper questions to emerge. Once access has been achieved, attention inevitably shifts toward structure. Who occupies positions of power? How are they portrayed? What assumptions shape their narratives? What forms of agency are available to them? Cyborg's history repeatedly pushes audiences toward these questions. His legacy becomes valuable precisely because it reveals how much work remains unfinished. This unfinished quality extends beyond questions of race and representation into the broader terrain of technological modernity. In many ways, Cyborg has become more relevant with time. When the character first appeared, the idea of a human being permanently integrated with complex technological systems still felt somewhat speculative. Today, the metaphor requires far less imagination. Modern individuals increasingly live through networks, platforms, devices, and infrastructures that mediate enormous portions of everyday experience. The distinction between online and offline existence grows less meaningful with each passing year. The boundary between person and system becomes increasingly difficult to define. Viewed from this perspective, Cyborg begins to resemble something unexpected. He is not merely a superhero. He is a prototype, not in a literal technological sense, but in a symbolic one. He anticipates cultural conditions that have become increasingly familiar. The struggle to maintain individuality within interconnected systems. The tension between convenience and dependence. The negotiation between visibility and autonomy. The uncertainty surrounding where human agency begins and where technological influence ends. These are no longer speculative concerns. They are central features of contemporary life. Perhaps that is why attempts to transform Cyborg into a straightforward symbol of progress have always felt incomplete. The character contains too much tension to function comfortably as a simple celebration of the future. Every optimistic reading encounters evidence of caution. Every pessimistic reading encounters evidence of possibility. Victor remains suspended between competing interpretations because the world surrounding him remains suspended between them as well. The mythology cannot resolve the contradiction because the culture producing the mythology has not resolved it either. There is something almost poetic about this outcome. Cyborg was introduced at a moment when many believed a new kind of superhero would emerge to represent a changing world. In some respects, that prediction proved correct. Victor Stone does represent a changing world. The surprise lies in what kind of representation he ultimately provides. Rather than embodying certainty about the future, he embodies uncertainty about it. Rather than offering a clear destination, he reveals a contested landscape. Rather than standing as a monument to progress, he functions as a map of its contradictions. And perhaps that was always inevitable. If Superman reflected the optimism of the 20th century, then Cyborg reflects the psychological condition of the 21st. A civilization surrounded by extraordinary technological capability, yet increasingly uncertain about its consequences. A culture committed to broader representation, yet still wrestling with older structures of power. A society more connected than any in human history, while simultaneously questioning what connection itself has become. Victor Stone stands at the intersection of all these forces. Not above them, not beyond them, directly within them. That is why Cyborg remains such an enduring figure despite never fully becoming the next Superman. The comparison ultimately misunderstands the role he was destined to play. Superman became an icon because he embodied a consensus. Cyborg became important because he embodies a debate. Superman represents a future that appeared coherent. Cyborg represents a future that appears fragmented, negotiated, and unresolved. One stands upon solid ground. The other stands on a shifting frontier where competing visions of humanity continue to collide. In the end, Cyborg's greatest significance may be that he exposes a truth modern culture often struggles to acknowledge. The most important myths are not always the ones that provide certainty. Sometimes they are the ones that reveal uncertainty with such clarity that it becomes impossible to ignore. Victor Stone was supposed to become the hero of a new era. Instead, he became something stranger, a reflection of an era still trying to understand itself. And as long as those questions remain unanswered, his story will continue to echo far beyond the boundaries of comic books, not as a symbol of where humanity is going, but as a reminder that humanity is still deciding.